Welcome to Epic HFY Stories. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to check if you've subscribed to our channel. It's completely free, and subscribing will ensure that our stories show up more often in your feed. The forest was quiet, its towering trees standing still as Ethan hiked through the Cascade Range in Oregon. The air was cool, but his mind was elsewhere, clouded with uncertainty. At 18, he thought he was supposed to have it all figured out. But here he was, carrying a backpack too big for him, filled with granola bars, his map upside down, and his sense of direction completely lost. Ethan chuckled to himself, realizing that he was only 18 and still feeling like a kid who had no idea what he was doing. Curiosity pushed him forward, but self-doubt followed like a shadow. The kind of dumb bravery only a teenager with no mortgage and too many action movies could muster. As the trail wound through the dense trees, the faint sound of a woodpecker tapping in the distance was the only thing breaking the silence. Suddenly, a low, disturbing noise sliced through the air. It was like a roar. Unnatural, otherworldly. His heart raced as the sound grew louder, more intense, and more frantic. Birds scattered from the treetops, squawking in panic. Ethan instinctively ducked, as if that would somehow help him against whatever was coming. And then it hit. The earth trembled violently, throwing him off balance. Ethan stumbled sideways, landing in a patch of bushes. His body crashed into the ground, his heart hammering in his chest as the tremor subsided. The ground beneath him had buckled as if something huge had landed nearby. He pushed himself up, wiping dirt off his pants and scanning the area. Smoke swirled in the distance, rising from what seemed like a burning crater. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to head for safety. But curiosity, as always, had a stronger grip on him. What if it's a meteor? Maybe I could be on the news, Ethan thought. He shook his head at his own foolishness, but there was no turning back now. He had to find out what that noise was. He trudged forward, ignoring the voice in his head that warned him to be cautious. His steps quickened as the crater came into view. It wasn't a meteor, as he'd hoped. No, this was something much stranger. The crater was glowing faintly, like the earth itself had cracked open to reveal something beneath. In the center, tangled among scorched branches and shattered metal, lay a figure. A woman. She was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Her skin shimmered in the dim light, dark and slick, like moonlight mixed with oil. Her limbs were long and unnaturally graceful, her body so perfect that it seemed unnatural in the harsh environment around her. Her armor, black and jagged like old lava rock, was cracked and hissing, as though it were still alive, still fighting to keep its form intact. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her ribs bruised and marked with faint, glowing cuts. For a moment, Ethan's mind raced. What is this? He thought she might be some kind of elaborate cosplayer who had gotten caught in some sort of space debris. But then, he took another look at her ears, elongated and graceful, and his heart skipped. This isn't a person. This is something else, something beyond what I know. He scrambled toward her, dropping to his knees beside her, and quickly pulled his emergency kit from his backpack. What am I doing? He asked himself. He wasn't a medic. He wasn't trained for this. But he couldn't just leave her there, could he? Hey, alien lady, Ethan muttered, his voice shaky. Don't die, please. I have like one bandage, a stick of gum, and a vague understanding of CPR from health class. So, you're welcome? For a moment, there was silence. Ethan held his breath, waiting for her to respond. He half expected her to wake up and immediately break him in half for daring to touch her, but instead she stirred faintly, her silver eyes fluttering open. They weren't just silver, though. They were liquid, like mercury suspended in glass, cold and unblinking, piercing through him as if she were looking straight into his very soul. Ethan froze. This is real. She's real, her mouth opened, and she muttered something in a language that rattled in Ethan's skull. The words were soft, almost melodic, but they had a sharp edge to them. The moment her eyes met his, time seemed to stop. His heart raced in his chest as he tried to make sense of the situation. But just as quickly as she opened her eyes, she passed out again, her body going limp in the dirt. For a moment, Ethan just sat there, staring at her. His mind was a blur of confusion and awe. This was no dream. This was real. He had just found an alien woman, lying in a crater, and now she had left him with more questions than answers. But Ethan wasn't one to back down. Not now. He dragged her to a nearby cave he had spotted earlier, his muscles straining from the effort, his mind racing. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't even know who or what she was. But he couldn't leave her there, not after everything that had happened. He set her down gently inside the cave, trying his best to care for her injuries with the little he had. The armor hissed as it cooled beside her, the strange symbols flashing weakly on its surface. Ethan could hardly believe what he was seeing. But it didn't matter. He had to help her. That's all he could focus on now. As the hours passed, he worked in silence, occasionally whispering to her, even though she didn't respond. I'm sorry, he thought. I don't know what's happening, but I'm trying to help. Finally, as the first light of morning seeped into the cave, Ethan drifted off to sleep, exhausted beyond measure. When he woke, he found her sitting up, her eyes scanning the cave like she was memorizing everything around her. Then her gaze locked onto him, the same piercing eyes from earlier. She didn't speak, but there was something about her that made Ethan feel small, like he didn't quite belong in her presence. I found you in a crater, Ethan said, trying to break the silence. You weren't in great shape, so I dragged you here. I might have dislocated a lung. Do aliens even have lungs? She tilted her head, her ears twitching slightly at his words. Then, without a word, she stood up. Her movements were graceful, almost inhuman. She was tall, taller than any human woman Ethan had ever seen, but she didn't seem threatening. Instead, there was something mysterious about her. I think I'm in over my head, Ethan muttered to himself. Please don't vaporize me. But she didn't answer. She simply glanced down at the pendant resting on her lap, a strange metallic object he hadn't noticed before. She gently touched it, and without another glance at Ethan, she walked toward the exit of the cave, disappearing into the morning mist. Ethan stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who was she? And why had she left him alone with just this strange pendant as a reminder? He reached for it, the pendant warm to the touch. It hummed faintly in his hand, like it was still alive. Ethan didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and yet Ethan couldn't shake the memory of the woman he had found in the forest. Her eyes, the strange pendant she had left behind. It all felt like something out of a dream, a bizarre encounter that had somehow gotten lodged deep in his mind. But life had a way of moving on. He tried to push it out of his thoughts, focusing on his routine, working, eating soggy fries at his apartment, and watching some low-budget documentary about UFOs. There was always something to distract him. But in the back of his mind, that alien woman and the pendant never really left. The pendant rested on his windowsill, pulsing faintly in the dark, like it had a life of its own. He could almost feel it hum through the air sometimes, like it missed her just as much as he did. "I'm probably just going crazy," he would say to himself, half laughing, half nervous. "It's just a rock, a weird rock, right?" But deep down, he knew it wasn't just a rock. One night, after finishing his shift and slumping into his couch with a root beer in hand, he felt it again. That hum. The faint, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the room. He glanced at the pendant on the windowsill. It was glowing softly, the kind of glow you only saw from something far beyond ordinary. Suddenly, the room seemed to press in on him. The air felt heavier, like the world was holding its breath. The light from his window flickered, casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed with notifications, but he didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the pendant. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sky outside his window split wide open. A rift, a tear in the heavens itself, cracked across the sky, an enormous gash of red, violet, and pulsing green. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't a northern light. It was something far more alien, more chaotic. Ethan stared, frozen in disbelief, as the air seemed to crackle with energy. The streetlights outside flickered, and a wave of pressure hit him, like the universe itself was taking a breath and forgetting to exhale. His mind barely registered what was happening, but his feet were already moving. He bolted out of the door, barefoot, underdressed, and more than a little out of his mind, as he followed the unnatural lights in the sky. He barely noticed the people around him, standing outside in their pajamas, mouths agape, eyes fixed on the rift that was slowly swallowing the sky. And then he saw it. A shape descending from the rift, sleek and shimmering like a predator. The ship moved with purpose, folding in on itself, shifting like some sort of cosmic origami. Trees bent away from its path, and his neighbor's chihuahua launched into a barking fit, as if trying to offer some sort of peace offering. The ship landed with a soft thud on the high school football field behind his apartment complex, completely destroying half the bleachers. The metal frame twisted under the craft's weight, and Ethan watched, stunned, as the thing came to a stop. He was rooted to the spot, hiding behind a hibiscus bush, still not sure if he was dreaming or losing his mind. And then, just like that, she stepped out. The alien warrior woman. Vera. Her ears were longer now, adorned with small, glowing nodes and metallic rings. Her armor had evolved, plated with luminous circuits that seemed to pulse with energy. Sharp edges, like she had been reforged by the stars themselves. She moved with grace and power, scanning the area like a predator on the hunt. The last time Ethan had seen her, she was barely alive, bleeding out in the forest. But now she walked like she owned gravity itself, her presence undeniable. Ethan's mouth went dry as her gaze locked onto his. He froze. She stared at him like he was the center of the universe, her silver eyes unblinking. He raised a hand awkwardly, unsure of what to do. "Hey, long time no see?" She took 2 steps forward, her boots crunching the broken asphalt beneath her. The silence between them stretched, thick and electric. "I never forgot you, human," she said, her voice deeper, more layered than he remembered. It was like there were multiple versions of her speaking at once, just out of sync. Ethan blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. Cool. Is this a social call, or are you here to critique my fashion sense?" Before she could respond, the ground behind her cracked open with a horrible screech, and something mechanical shot out of the sky. A drone, sleek and insect-like, bristling with weapons. It zoomed down toward Vera, with deadly intent. Without even flinching, Vera moved with deadly speed, drawing a blade from her back and hurling it through the air. The blade sliced through the drone with a sound like thunder wrapped in a violin string. It exploded in a burst of sizzling green dust, the smell like ozone and burnt marshmallows. Vera turned back to Ethan, completely unfazed by the chaos around them. "I need you," she said simply. Ethan, still stunned, blinked, trying to wrap his head around everything happening around him. "Okay, wait. I can't even go 30 minutes without needing a bathroom break, and you want me to come with you? To space?" She didn't smile, but there was a glimmer in her eyes. She stepped closer, and for the first time since she had arrived, Ethan caught a glimpse of something softer in her demeanor. "You gave me your strength when I had none," she said, her voice low and steady. "You saved me. Now I save you." He stared at her, still unsure of what he was hearing. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. That sounded like a good line from an action movie, but I didn't ask for saving. Vera, undeterred, gestured for him to follow. "The galaxy is burning," she said, her voice serious now. "And Earth is no longer safe." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but all that came out was a dry laugh. He looked at the wreckage of the football field, the destroyed bleachers, the drone's remains scattered in the grass, and then back at Vera, at this towering, otherworldly warrior standing in front of him, asking him to follow her into the unknown. "Okay, fine," he muttered. "I guess I'll pack a bag. I'm still gonna need snacks, though." Ethan's world had shifted entirely in just a few short hours. He had gone from a quiet, ordinary life, surrounded by trees in Oregon's Cascade Range, to standing in the middle of a wrecked football field, staring at a spaceship that had just dropped from a rift in the sky. And there she was again, the alien warrior woman who had once been lying unconscious in the woods. Now she was standing before him, alive, stronger than before, and radiating an energy he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Vera, as she had introduced herself, stood tall and confident. Her appearance was more advanced than Ethan remembered. Her armor had evolved, now covered in luminous circuits that pulsed with power, her ears adorned with tiny glowing nodes and metallic rings. She moved with an ease that suggested she had long mastered gravity itself. Ethan, on the other hand, was still trying to catch his breath, still processing the surreal turn his life had taken. She didn't speak, but her gaze was unwavering as it locked onto him. There was no question. "You're coming with me." Vera's voice was steady, more intense than before. Ethan couldn't help but laugh nervously. "Wait, what? I can barely keep it together on Earth, and now you want me to hop on your ship and go to space?" The words felt ridiculous even as they left his mouth. How could this possibly be happening? But before he could ask more questions, the ground beneath them rumbled. Ethan looked up just in time to see a drone, sleek and insect-like, jump down from the rift in the sky, its glowing weapons aimed directly at Vera. Without hesitation, she drew a blade from her back and threw it with lethal precision. The blade sliced through the drone like a hot knife through butter, exploding into a cloud of green dust that burned the air. The smell was sharp, like ozone and burnt marshmallows. But Vera didn't flinch. She barely acknowledged the destruction she had just caused, turning her gaze back to Ethan. "I need you," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. Ethan stood there, stunned, his heart still racing. He wanted to argue, to ask questions, but the reality of the situation was impossible to ignore. She had just saved them both. And more disturbingly, she was saying that she needed him. "Okay, sure, why not?" he muttered, looking at the chaos surrounding them, still in disbelief. But, can I at least pack a bag? Vera didn't smile. She just nodded toward the ship. You'll need more than a bag. As if on cue, the ship's door slid open. The interior was like nothing Ethan had ever seen. Dark, sleek, and alive. Panels shifted on the walls as though the ship itself was breathing. Teal and violet lights flickered and pulsed, casting an eerie glow. The air felt different, charged with an energy that made Ethan's skin tingle. Vera moved forward without hesitation, her pace steady. Ethan hesitated for just a second, then followed. What choice did he have? He could refuse and stay on Earth, but at this point, everything about his life had already changed. It seemed like the universe had decided for him. The ship was enormous, stretching down long corridors that twisted and turned, making him feel like he was walking through some kind of alien maze. "What's going on?" he finally asked, his voice weak with uncertainty. "Why me? Why now?" Vera didn't answer right away. She led him into a large room that seemed to pulse with energy, filled with screens and strange machinery. "There's a war," she said flatly, her voice suddenly serious. "A war that has been raging for centuries. My people, the Zalari, have been fighting the Arkan throne for control of the galaxy. The rebellion is dying. The Arkan forces are advancing." Ethan felt his heart drop. A war? He had no idea what she was talking about. A war? His voice cracked, the magnitude of her words starting to sink in. "What does this have to do with me?" Vera turned toward him, her gaze piercing. "Earth was supposed to remain untouched, insignificant. But they've found you, and now Earth is no longer safe." Ethan's mind spun, his thoughts racing as he tried to process what she was saying. "They found me?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why would anyone be looking for me? I'm just some random guy." Vera didn't seem to hear him. She was already moving toward a control panel, typing something on a screen. "The pendant," she said without looking back. "The one you gave me. It tracked you. You're connected to this war now. Your actions have consequences that ripple through the galaxy." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm what? A pawn? Some kind of cosmic bait?" Vera paused, her back still turned to him. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but no less intense. "No. You're a variable. The Arkan forces think you hold the key to victory. They believe that you have the power to tip the balance of the war." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I don't even know what's going on, and you're telling me I'm important in some war?" He felt the absurdity of it all. He was just a kid from Earth, stumbling through life, trying to figure things out. Now he was supposed to play some part in a galactic war? Vera turned back to him, her eyes unwavering. "You've already changed things, Ethan. The fact that you saved me changed the course of everything. Now your choices will decide the future." The ship's engines hummed, a deep, resonant sound that shook the very walls. Vera gestured toward a viewport, and Ethan joined her, staring out at the vast expanse of space stretching before them. He could see a distant station, floating in the dark, surrounded by countless ships. "What's that?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Station Umber," Vera replied. "Rebel command. It's where we'll meet with the others." Ethan's heart sank. He wasn't sure if he was ready for any of this, but there was no turning back now. The stars outside the window were no longer just distant lights. They were part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Vera's voice broke through his thoughts. "Prepare yourself. We'll need you at full strength." Ethan looked at her, still unsure about everything that was happening, but he nodded. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted. "But I guess I'll have to be." The ship began its descent toward the station, the massive structure coming into view. Ethan felt his stomach tighten as they got closer. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of something much bigger. Whether he was ready or not, the universe had chosen him. "Welcome to the front lines," Vera said quietly, her voice more serious than he had ever heard it before. As the ship docked with the station, the door hissed open, and Ethan stepped out into a new reality. The war had already begun. The ship descended smoothly, cutting through the thin atmosphere surrounding the massive space station. Ethan's eyes were fixed on the enormous structure ahead. Station Umber, Rebel Command, loomed in the distance like a city made of metal and stars. It was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The station's outer surface was a mass of shifting platforms, antennas and flickering lights, all working in perfect, synchronized chaos. The closer they got, the more the station seemed to pulse with life, a constant hum of activity that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Ethan stepped off the ship, his legs feeling heavy under the weight of the moment. The air around him was different, thicker, charged with a sense of urgency. As he walked alongside Vera, the energy in the station was palpable. Alien beings of all shapes and sizes rushed past them, each one moving with purpose. Some were armored, others robed, while a few floated along, moving like clouds of mist. Ethan couldn't help but feel like he had wandered into a dream, a nightmare that was somehow too real to ignore. Vera moved through the chaos like a force of nature, and Ethan had no choice but to keep up, his mind racing with questions. He was far out of his depth. His life had gone from a quiet existence in Oregon to standing on an alien space station with a woman who was part of an intergalactic rebellion. His feet shuffled on the metal floors, and he could feel the eyes of the station's inhabitants on him, some curious, others suspicious. He wasn't exactly fitting in. As they made their way deeper into the station, Ethan couldn't help but notice how different everything was. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting slightly as they moved past. The lights flickered occasionally, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the vast hallways. It was both mesmerizing and unsettling. There was a sense of danger here, of something bigger than just a fight for survival. Finally, they reached a large chamber. It looked like a conference room, though the walls were lined with holographic maps and projections that seemed to float in midair. At the center of the room stood a table, low to the ground, surrounded by figures who looked like they had seen their fair share of battles. Alien leaders, warriors, strategists, rebels. There were 4 of them, standing still, their eyes scanning the room with unwavering focus. One of them, a towering creature that looked like a walking tree trunk, stepped forward and nodded at Vera. His bark-like skin shifted slightly, and Ethan swore he saw roots twitch beneath the surface. "This is Elias," Vera said, gesturing toward the group. "He's the one who helped me on Earth." Ethan gave a weak smile, feeling out of place as the group turned their attention to him. The other beings didn't seem to care much for him, though. One of them, a humanoid with robes made of shifting light, turned its gaze on him, but didn't speak. The third was a squat, angry-looking creature, half frog, half bear, who looked at Ethan as if he were something to be studied, poked, and prodded. Finally, the last figure, a human like him, though far more intense, nodded at him, his silver eyes seeming to pierce through Ethan's soul. "The human," the silver-eyed man said, his voice smooth but somehow filled with a quiet authority. "The one who has changed the course of things." Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender, trying to lighten the mood. "Yeah, that's me. The guy who saved an alien, and now I'm apparently involved in some kind of intergalactic war." No big deal. There was a brief silence, and then the frog-bear hybrid snorted, as though Ethan's humor had missed the mark completely. Vera's eyes softened, just a touch. You've changed things, Ethan. More than you realize. Ethan looked around at the faces in the room, each one more serious than the last. He felt the weight of their gazes. Look, I don't know what you want from me. I'm just a guy who got dragged into this whole mess. All I did was help you when you were... what, knocked out? How does that change anything? Elias, the human, stepped forward, his silver eyes narrowing as he studied Ethan. It's not about what you did, but what you can do. The Arkan throne is advancing. They're ruthless, relentless. They believe you're the key to stopping them. The words hit Ethan hard. He had no idea what any of this meant, but it was starting to feel like he was being thrust into something far bigger than he was ready for. So you all think I'm some kind of weapon? Or a savior? Elias didn't flinch. You are a symbol, a variable. The Arkan forces don't understand you. They think you can be controlled, manipulated, but what they don't realize is that you are the wild card. You can change things in ways they can't predict. Vera stepped in, her voice steady and calm. This is bigger than all of us, Ethan. The rebellion is on the edge of losing everything, and Earth is no longer just a small, insignificant planet in the galaxy. The Arkan throne wants it, and they'll stop at nothing to take it. That's why you're here. Ethan rubbed his temples. Okay, so I'm important. Great. But I'm not ready for this. I can't even get my life together back home, and now you're telling me I'm supposed to help save an entire planet. Vera's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder, surprising him with her warmth. You're stronger than you know. The choices you make now will echo throughout the galaxy. Ethan stood in silence for a moment, looking at the faces around him. These were beings who had fought in wars that spanned entire star systems, and they were looking to him as if he held the power to change everything. He felt small in the face of it all, but one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. So, what happens next? He asked quietly, his voice more steady than he felt. Vera nodded toward the holographic map on the wall. Next, we fight. We have a plan, but we need you. We need your help to outsmart the Arkan forces before they can destroy us all. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Ethan's answer. There was no turning back now. His life had already been altered beyond recognition. He looked at the map, the flashing red zones marking the areas where the Arkan forces were advancing. The rebellion had lost ground, but it wasn't over yet. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew that somehow he was meant to be a part of this. Somehow his choices, his actions, mattered. Okay, he said, his voice filled with a new sense of resolve. Let's do this. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest as he followed Vera through the labyrinthine corridors of Station Umber. Every step he took seemed to echo in the metallic halls, the gravity of his situation sinking deeper into his bones. He was no longer the guy who woke up in his apartment and had to face mundane life problems. He was in the middle of a galactic rebellion, fighting against a force that threatened not just Earth, but the entire galaxy. As they moved through the station, Vera didn't speak much. She walked ahead, her eyes scanning their surroundings, always alert. Ethan tried to focus on his steps, trying not to think about the magnitude of everything that was happening. But it wasn't easy. Every person he passed on the station seemed to have a story. Each one a soldier, a rebel, someone who had fought in wars far beyond what he could imagine. They reached a small briefing room, filled with alien soldiers and tacticians. Some were humanoid, others seemed to shift in and out of form, like living clouds of mist. The room fell silent as Vera entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. They all knew her, respected her. And now she was bringing in someone who was still trying to wrap his head around the fact that he wasn't just some bystander anymore. He was part of something far greater than himself. Vera stood at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the gathered group. "Everyone, this is Ethan. He's the human who saved my life. He's here to help us in the coming fight." Ethan tried not to shrink under the weight of their gazes. These were battle-hardened warriors. They had seen the horrors of the war firsthand, and they were looking at him like he was supposed to be some kind of hero. He wasn't sure what kind of hero he was supposed to be. But there was no turning back now. The silver-eyed man from before, Elias, spoke first, his voice calm but laced with authority. "We don't have time to waste. The Arkan forces are pushing forward faster than we expected. They've already taken several key systems, and they're coming for us next." He gestured to the holographic map in the center of the room, which displayed various star systems marked with red and yellow alerts. The rebellion was being pushed to the brink, and Earth was now a prime target. "We need a strategy," Elias continued. "We know the Arkan throne is preparing for a major assault on Station Umber. Our only hope is to disrupt their plans before they can launch their final offensive." Ethan looked at the map, his mind racing. The rebellion was outnumbered, outgunned, and their resources were dwindling. He couldn't understand all of the military jargon flying around the table, but he did understand one thing. They were fighting a losing battle. "How do we stop them?" Ethan finally asked, his voice quieter than he intended. He wasn't sure if anyone expected him to ask that question, but he felt the need to. After all, he had been dragged into this, and now he had to do something. Vera's gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw something like hope in her eyes. "We're going to make them think we're weaker than we are," she said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "We'll use their own arrogance against them. We strike when they least expect it." She turned back to the map. "We'll hit their supply lines, sabotage their ships, and create a distraction. The Arkan throne thinks they can just steamroll over us, but they're wrong." Ethan swallowed hard. "And you want me to be a part of that?" Vera didn't hesitate. "You're the key. You've already shown that you can make the impossible happen. Now, it's time to prove it again." Before Ethan could respond, the door to the room slid open, and a new figure entered. A tall, angular alien with shimmering scales and piercing blue eyes. He was flanked by two other soldiers, each one more intimidating than the last. Vera nodded at the newcomer. "This is Commander Lethar. He'll be leading the strike team." Commander Lethar stepped forward, his eyes studying Ethan for a moment before speaking. "We'll need you at your best if we're going to succeed. The Arkan forces are ruthless, and they're not afraid to burn everything to the ground." Ethan met his gaze. "I'm not a soldier. I'm just a guy. I don't even know how to fight." Lethar raised an eyebrow. "We all start somewhere, but you have something the Arkan can't predict. That's why you're here." Ethan took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but somehow, he knew there was no turning back. "So what now?" Ethan asked. Vera glanced at him, her expression serious. "Now we fight." The tension in the room was palpable as plans were laid out. Everyone had a role to play. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being thrust into the middle of something he wasn't ready for. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a guy who had helped someone in need, and now he was caught up in a war between ancient civilizations. But as the rebellion's leaders began to strategize, a sense of responsibility started to grow inside him. They believed in him. They needed him. And somehow, despite his fear, he couldn't let them down. "You're going to need to learn quickly," Vera said, her voice steady but urgent. "We don't have the luxury of time." And just like that, Ethan knew his life had changed forever. The fight for survival, for freedom, had begun. The meeting stretched into hours as the plans were finalized. The rebellion had to move quickly. Every moment counted. As the discussions continued, Ethan felt the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just about a fight for survival. It was about the future of the galaxy, and the role he was now meant to play in it. As the meeting broke up, Vera turned to Ethan. "It's time," she said simply. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready, but he knew this was it. He couldn't walk away. Not now. He followed her down the corridors once more, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. This time, however, he wasn't just an observer. He was a participant in something far larger than himself. The rebellion had a chance, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like maybe, just maybe, he could help tip the scales. The war was just beginning, and Ethan was about to find out what it meant to fight for something greater than himself. The air in the rebel station grew heavy with tension as the final preparations for the strike began. Ethan could feel it in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was standing in a war room now, surrounded by some of the galaxy's fiercest fighters. They had all been through hell, and they were looking to him, the guy who had only recently learned how to survive a camping trip, to somehow play a pivotal role in the fate of their rebellion. The final assault on the Arkan forces' supply lines was set in motion, a desperate bid to throw the enemy off balance before the full-scale invasion began. The Arkan Empire had underestimated the rebels, and now the rebellion was using that arrogance against them. Vera stood at the center of the room, her face lit by the soft glow of a holographic map, showing the location of enemy positions. She was focused, calculating every move. Her role was clear. She was a commander, and she had made her decision. They would strike at dawn, hitting the Arkan fleet where it hurt the most. Ethan stood at the back of the room, trying to keep up with the rapid discussions. His heart raced as he listened to military jargon and strategies, words that meant nothing to him just a few days ago, but now seemed so important. His hands were clammy, his palms sweaty, but there was no time to doubt. The rebellion was counting on him. "Ethan," Vera's voice cut through the noise, pulling his attention back to her. She was looking at him now, her expression unwavering. "You're with me on the ground. You'll need to stay close. The enemy is stronger than we expected, but we have a chance if we move quickly." For a moment, Ethan's mind went blank. "What?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "You're asking me to go with you, into the middle of the action?" Vera's eyes softened for just a moment, a flicker of something human in her gaze. "You've come this far. You can do this." She paused, the weight of her words sinking in. "We'll be risking our lives, but the chance to strike the Arkan Empire could change everything." He looked around the room, at the faces of those who were preparing for the battle ahead. They were ready to fight, to sacrifice. And here he was, still unsure of what he was even doing. But something in Vera's words struck a chord within him. "Okay," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm in." The rebellion's forces moved out as the station's hangars opened, revealing a fleet of ships that were as diverse as the species that flew them. Each vessel was a patchwork of alien technology, sleek and futuristic, yet rough around the edges, showing signs of years of fighting. Ethan was assigned to a small assault team, and as the doors to their ship closed, he felt the overwhelming weight of what he was about to do. The ship shuddered as it took off, cutting through the station's atmosphere and heading toward the battlefield. Ethan strapped himself in, trying to steady his breathing as the stars outside streaked by in a blur of light. The pressure of space travel was intense, but it was nothing compared to the pressure building inside him. "You good?" Vera's voice broke through the static of the ship's intercom. She was sitting across from him, checking the settings on her weapon. "Yeah, I think so." Ethan's voice was tight, his hands gripping the armrests. She tilted her head, studying him with a look that almost felt reassuring. "Don't think too much. Trust your instincts. Focus." The ship jolted slightly as it broke through the atmosphere and into open space. Ahead, a small fleet of Arkan ships was on the move. The rebellion had managed to gather a small force, and they were planning to ambush the Arkan fleet in a narrow stretch of space, catching them off guard. Ethan's stomach tightened as the ships around them readied their weapons. The mission was simple: disable the Arkan supply ships, cause chaos, and escape before the enemy could retaliate. But Ethan knew that simple was a word that didn't belong in war. The countdown began, and the ship's engines hummed with power. "Ready?" Vera's voice was steady. Ethan nodded. "Let's do this." The ship plunged into the battle, weaving through incoming fire. The Arkan ships were massive, gleaming black hulks of metal bristling with weapons. The rebellion's ships were smaller, faster, but not as heavily armed. It was a battle of speed and strategy, and every move counted. The ground troops, including Ethan and Vera, were deployed onto a barren asteroid that was strategically important for the Arkan Empire. Their goal was to infiltrate, sabotage, and escape before reinforcements could arrive. As soon as Ethan's boots hit the rocky surface, he felt the weight of the situation. The air was thin, and the ground beneath him vibrated with the distant rumble of artillery. He followed Vera as they moved through a narrow canyon toward the enemy's supply depot. They weren't alone. The Arkan forces were already setting up defenses, and the sound of blasters and explosions filled the air. It was chaos, controlled chaos, at least on the rebel side. The Arkan forces were disorganized, caught off guard, but their superior numbers were still a threat. "Stay low, move fast," Vera ordered, her voice calm and commanding. Ethan nodded, trying to focus as they crouched behind large rock formations. They were close now, just a few hundred yards from the Arkan supply depot. The hum of energy shields and the rhythmic thud of alien boots reverberated through the canyon. He could feel his heart racing, but Vera was right beside him, her presence a calming force. "You're doing great," she whispered as they crouched low behind cover. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the ground near them, sending debris flying through the air. Ethan ducked instinctively, the blast wave knocking him off balance, but Vera was quick, pulling him back into cover. "Get a grip, Ethan!" she shouted over the noise of gunfire. "This is it! We push forward!" With her help, they sprinted toward the depot. The explosions continued to rain down, and the air was filled with the crackle of weapons fire. As they approached the depot's entrance, Vera signaled for him to stay low. She moved forward, her eyes scanning for enemies. Ethan followed her lead, trying to mimic her actions. It wasn't long before they reached the supply storage. Vera quickly set the charges, her movements efficient and precise. "In place," she said, as she turned to him. "We need to move fast. The Arkan forces are already regrouping." Ethan nodded, adrenaline coursing through him. They ran, barely escaping the blast as the charges detonated, sending the Arkan depot up in flames. The sound of the explosion echoed through the asteroid, and the shockwave pushed them both forward. The mission was a success, but it wasn't over yet. The Arkan forces were retaliating, and the rebellion had to move fast. As they made their way back to the ship, the chaos of battle intensified. Ethan could hear the roar of distant engines and the rush of enemy forces closing in. But in that moment, he realized something. He wasn't just a guy anymore. He was part of something bigger, part of a fight that could change the fate of the galaxy. "We made it," Vera said, her voice soft but filled with satisfaction. Ethan looked back at the asteroid, now burning in the distance. "We did." The war was far from over, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he was ready to face whatever came next.